This is Vivica Williams, and you're watching Head to Head. In the last few weeks, there have been some major protests in Russia, the largest since 2011, 2012. And there's some growing talk that the majority of these active protesters are from the new generation of Russians who've known only Putin as president. So are these significant? Is this evidence of coming change in Russia? Well, joining us today to discuss just this is Issac Webb, co-editor of Global Voices RuNet Echo project and a freelance journalist in Kyiv, whose writings have been featured in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and other publications. Thank you so much for joining us today, Issac.
Thanks so much for having me, Vivica.
So let's jump right in. How significant were these protests in Russia?
So we should, I think, maybe start with how these protests began, which was a major investigation, corruption investigation that started, it was publicized by and led by opposition leader Alexei Navalny and published on at the beginning of March. He then used his really significant social media following to kind of mobilize support among opposition members and among particularly youth, Russian youth. So through Kontakte,
which is the Russian version of Facebook.
The Russian version of Facebook, through Twitter, through his own website, he was able to mobilize quite a few protesters to come out. Ultimately, over 100,000 people turned out in about 100 cities across Russia.
So not just Moscow, just around Russian as a whole.
Right, and I think this is one of the points of divergence where these protests maybe differ from protests in 2011, 2012, is this is, I think, one of the first moments where there's been really kind of major pan-national protests to oppose corruption within the government.
So this wasn't opposition to the government so much. You're thinking this was more against anti-corruption?
Well, this certainly all started with anti-corruption and started with this investigation, which, although it featured some kind of other higher-level members of the Russian government, it really centered on Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who was found to, or exposed, revealed to have owned and still owns more than $1 billion in assets tied up in yachts, in luxury real estate, in vineyards, and this, I think, was maybe one of the major reasons why people turned out. For many years, Medvedev had been seen as someone who was perhaps more liberal in the Russian government and more inclined towards reform. And so to see that he had been a part of this systemic corruption, which Russians kind of acknowledged to exist, perhaps pushed these protests to the next level.
And so the protests began on March 26th. Was this the largest, the only day of protest in Russia?
Well, so the protests continued the next weekend, but there were a large number of protesters, including the protest organizers, who were jailed, albeit briefly, following the first round of protests on March 26th. And so, including Alexei Navalny. And so the protests the following week and the follow-up protests were much smaller. Only about 100 people turned out in Moscow, many of whom were arrested. And so I think, thinking about where perhaps this is going in the future, there was a lot of talk after the March 26th protests that perhaps this, there had been kind of an awakening of the next generation of Russians, an awakening of those who had believed in or been a part of what people were calling the Crimean consensus following the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But I think the follow-up protests and the relatively small size of those protests suggest that maybe this is not 2011, 2012, and these kind of mass protests may not continue as long as many had once thought. And I think another part of these protests is the youth element. And so after March 26th, a lot of commenters were kind of picking up on the fact that a lot of people in their late teens and 20s, millennials, we'd say in the U.S., were participating in these protests across Russia. But I think when we note that, it's important to remember that just a couple years ago, we were talking about a generation of Putin acolytes.
Right,
we were talking
this
about
young group,
this young generation that people were saying this is the Putin generation,
right,
who had only grown up and only known Putin's Russia. So I think that the fact that that in these most recent protests those people came out is perhaps significant, but also it's important not to overplay who was out there, because a large percentage of Russian youth still support the Putin regime.
All right. Well, let's take a moment to look back at those protests. So we're going to take a moment to look back at what was going on in the last few weeks in Russia.
Hi, it's Navalny with a special edition of our video blog. I have some kind of formic alcohol here, which I use to wash myself clean, and I have a stylish green face, which perfectly matches our headquarters brand colours. And I just wanted to say one thing. Maybe in the Kremlin they believe that I won't make video addresses with a green face, but I will definitely make them, because more people will watch them now, and it definitely won't stop me. I appeal to everyone, by all means, take part in rallies against corruption across the country on March the 26th. We will definitely win. I got to know about the protest from the internet, from Navalny's blog. I went there mostly out of interest to find out how strong the opposition is, how many people would take to the streets, and also to support the demands that the authorities respond in some way to the obvious fact of corruption.
Можно, ребятки?
If there were some questions over the protest the other week, whether it was related to Alexei Navalny and so on, now it is obvious that the problem has escalated because there are so many detained in different cities, from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad. In general, people are beaten and hurt. Even now, here, we see people are being detained and provocateurs appear.
Those were pretty impressive. Isaac, so when we look back at those videos of the protests going on, we see that, yes, indeed, there were a lot of young people involved in the protest. But as you said, in the follow-up protest, there were a lot fewer people. So what do you think? What's the future here with protests in Russia?
Well, I think that the kind of relatively limited scale of the follow-up protests suggests, well, both the efficacy of the Russian government to clamp down on these kind of social media websites, which were really important in sparking the first protests on March 26th. In the immediate wake of those March 26th protests, the Russian state censor was able to block several significant websites that were trying to mobilize people to participate in the follow-up protests. And so I think the fact that effort was successful, I think doesn't bode well for the future of these protests. Although certainly we'll have to wait until Navalny is released from jail and until he can get back to mobilizing people, because he has really been, and his investigation of Medvedev in this case was really the driving force behind the protests. So wait to see when he gets out what he can do.
Okay. Well, that's all we can do is wait to see. Isaac, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you very much for this insight into these protests.
Thank you, Vivica.
This is Vivica Williams with UATV. Today we were joined by Issac Webb, co-editor of Global Voices RuNet Echo project and a freelance journalist. And we discussed the past protests in the last few weeks in Russia for anti-corruption.